Hello and welcome to Travels Through Time. In each episode of this podcast, we invite a special guest to take us on a tailored tour of the past. Travels Through Time is brought to you in partnership with History Today, Britain's best-loved serious history magazine. You can read articles relating to this podcast and more about our guests at historytoday.com/travels. There is also a special subscription offer for Travels Through Time listeners. 3 issues for just £1 each. If you could travel back through time, where would you go? What would you like to experience? What would you like to find out? I'm Peter Moore, and welcome to the podcast where we invite an expert guest to do just that, to explore 1 year in history through 3 different scenes. Today's guest is the author and cultural historian Mike J. Mike is best known for his writing on the history of science and medicine. He's curated exhibitions like Bethlem, the Asylum and Beyond for the Wellcome Trust, and Brilliant Visions, which opened at the Bethlem Museum of the Mind in May. Among his books that touch on topics we'll be talking about today are The Influencing Machine, which tells the strange story of James Tilly Matthews, An Atmosphere of Heaven, a cross-cultural biography that charts the tale of the maverick Georgian doctor Thomas Beddoes. Oliver Sacks called Atmosphere of Heaven magnificent. A warm welcome to Travels Through Time, Mike.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Okay, could you begin with the first and most important question, which is to tell us what year you'd like to go to today, and the supplementary question to that, as ever, is why?
The year that I would most like to visit is 1799, which is really a way of looking at what I think is the most fascinating decade, the 1790s. I think the 1790s were extraordinary to people at the time. Everybody knew, with the events that had been set in motion by the French Revolution, people of all political stripes seemed to have agreed that by the end of the decade the world would be transformed. And so it was, but not in the way that they imagined. And there are 3 characters who I'd like to look at. They were all progressive, enlightened figures. They had, in the early 1790s, dreams and hopes of transforming the world. By 1799, all of those dreams had crashed and burned.
It's a few years after the French Revolution has begun, and we've been through this first phase of the revolutionary period, where there's a lot of hope in many quarters, a lot of terror in the eyes of the establishment in particular. And then moving on towards 1799, we know there's the mutiny in the Channel, for example, which happens in 1797, and then the year after you have a rebellion, I suppose, in Ireland, which then gets underway.
There was an enormous amount of unrest in Britain, and I was drawn to these stories because British history tends to skate over them. There was Waterloo, and then there was the British Empire, but in the 1790s, the British response to the French Revolution was very intense, very panicked at certain points in terms of the political establishment, and there was enormous and articulate and very widespread desire for political reform. At the beginning of the 1790s, after the French Revolution, it was widely welcomed in Britain. People wore revolutionary cockades in their hats and they greeted each other as citizen. It is exactly that. Okay. But 1792, I suppose, was the beginning of the reaction. That's when Tom Paine is prosecuted in his absence for seditious libel for rights of man. 1794, after the collapse of very high-profile treason trials against reformers, the right of habeas corpus is suspended, which is a terrific shock to the British population because all through the 18th century, habeas corpus has been one of the great British liberties, always contrasted with the old regime in France, where, just a letter from the king was enough to keep you locked up forever.
So habeas corpus, just to define that, is right to free trial. Right?
Yeah, it was the right of any British subject to be charged and judged by the jury of one's peers.
And that was suspended in the 1790s. That's right.
It was, and that was followed by a whole series of measures which became known as William Pitt's Reign of Terror, which were kind of a response to the terror across the Channel. So in 1796 there were laws called the Gagging Bills, which redefined treason, so almost any kind of political dissent could be regarded as treason. There was a Seditious Meetings Act, which made any public meetings prima facie illegal, and then there were more laws against naval mutineers and trades unions and so on. Yeah, there's fear of revolutionary fifth columns and dissenters and seditionaries, possibly in league with the French revolutionaries across the Channel. This is a very acute fear in Ireland. And in response to that, there are, as you say, Church and King mobs. So there are people, under the banners of Church and King, sort of taking to the streets and, marching and protesting and targeting the property of dissenters and reformers.
So I think it's a really good overview of what's going on in terms of the big historical picture as we teeter up towards the year 1800. So we're in 1799. And let's start the time travels now with your first scene, because we're going to start on the 1st of January, New Year's Day, 1799. Could you tell us where you'd like to go for your first of three scenes, please?
I would like to go to Coldbath Fields Prison, which is a new-built prison to the east of London in Clerkenwell, and to one particular cell in the basement, a tiny cell, 7 foot by 7 foot, in which is housed the remarkable and contested figure, Colonel Edward Marcus Despard, who is being held there without trial and without charges. And
so this links to what you were talking about just a minute ago, doesn't it?
It does.
The suspension of Habeas Corpus.
If you want to visualise the scene, and if you've been watching the latest season of Poldark on the BBC, this is the scene with which the first episode opens.
So this is the first scene of the new Poldark.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're in. I think there's a few things which will, questions which jump up immediately. One, he was obviously a military man. You've told us he was a colonel. And two, what was he doing in there? Why was he incarcerated?
Well, this was the question that everybody wanted to know the answer to, which is why everyone was waiting to see what charges would be brought against him. But in fact, no charges were brought against him. He was kept locked up there. Nobody was allowed to visit him. He was one of a few dozen prisoners of this type who'd been swept up after the Great Rebellion broke in Ireland.
So a political prisoner, yeah?
So a political prisoner. The Coldbath Fields nickname around London at that time was England's Bastille. I think the cultural reference we might reach for today was Guantanamo Bay,
right.
A kind of black hole in the criminal justice system into which this new category of terrorist had fallen.
Right, okay. So just tell us a bit more about Colonel Despard. He's an interesting, intriguing character. Do you know what Despard looked like?
Yes, there's a portrait of him, which may be by George Romney, and there's 2 or 3 etchings which are in the National Portrait Gallery. He looks really quite like his former comrade in arms, Horatio Nelson. He's Anglo-Irish in background, grew up in Dublin, went straight from Dublin Military Academy to service in Jamaica, and he's lived most of his life out in the Caribbean. He's got sort of fair curling hair, and in these portraits he's on a spectrum from sort of dignified Nelsonian at one end to more grizzled, weather-beaten and piratical at the other.
So was he a figure of some significance at this moment? So if we say it's the 1st of January, it's New Year's Day, is Despard a word or a name that's on people's lips at this time?
He's on his way to becoming probably the cause célèbre of Pitt's reign of terror.
So why were they so scared of him?
Well, Despard, like a lot of the other characters that we're going to meet, had a very interesting early 1790s, different from everybody else's, because he'd spent very, very little time in Britain up until this point. But out in the Caribbean, he had served with Nelson very heroically as a British Army officer, and he'd then been made superintendent of the Bay of Honduras, which is what's now Belize, which had just been ceded to the British as an enclave in what had formerly been Spanish territory. This is as a result of a peace treaty with Spain. And his job was to round up all the British subjects who'd been living illegally along the Mosquito Shore, as it was called, this very remote and desolate area, who were a mixture of traders, smugglers, brewers, freed slaves, ex-soldiers, a motley crew, as they'd have been called at the time, of sort of mixed race. And so his job was to sweep these people up and to house them in the Bay of Honduras. In the Bay of Honduras was a community called the Baymen, who were mahogany planters, rather like the sort of planters in Jamaica. They were white, they were wealthy, they were well established. They'd been working their trade illegally because it had technically been Spanish territory, and they were now obliged to share with everybody else, and this was Despard's job. The Baymen, who were very, very good at representing themselves, making their case to Whitehall, wrote a torrent of letters to the Home Office saying, this new upstart colonel is giving away our precious mahogany logging lands and trades to this group of people of colour, and he's going to destroy the mahogany trade. Despard was summoned back to London to explain himself. In London, although he'd technically been following orders, he discovered that in fact the British government was far more interested in the mahogany money than they were in the sort of issues of social justice and
so
the
he was
internal
involved
administration.
Okay.
As a result of this, he lost his commission. There were disputes about his expenses. He ended up broke and in debtor's prison, where he came across and, as we would say today, was radicalised by reading Tom Paine's Rights of Man. Coldbath Fields, where he was imprisoned without trial when we meet him in 1799. This was a purpose-built prison, 3 stories high, high walls. He was locked up in solitary confinement in a cell that was 7 foot by 7 foot, fed on bread and water, not allowed any books or any possessions. His wife, Catherine, was allowed to speak to him occasionally through the bars, but even MPs were banned from visiting. Nobody was allowed to know what was going on in there.
Did he have any hopes of being released, or was he resigned to a gloomy fate, would you say?
There was no idea of when habeas corpus might be reinstated. There was no guarantee that he would ever face trial. There were only a couple of people who stopped him being forgotten. One was his wife, Catherine, who he'd come back with from Jamaica. She was a black woman of extraordinary sort of articulacy and power, who campaigned on his behalf and enlisted one single solitary MP who took an interest in this, Sir Francis Burdett, who was an independent MP, later to become a radical when that term became popular, who was the only person, the only MP who asked any questions about this. When he mentioned it in the House of Commons in debates, then even people who we think of as liberals like William Wilberforce would say, oh, this is all nonsense about Coldbath Fields. I've heard from reputable sources they eat as well there as I do at my own table.
I'm intrigued that you mentioned that this is the first scene of the new season of Poldark, which is a programme lots of people know, very popular. Are they going to be following the Despard story? Is this going to feature in the programme?
Yes, they are. At the very beginning, we go back to the very first episode of Poldark when we met him wounded on the battlefield in the American War, and it turns out that Colonel Despard was his commander at that point. So now, when Colonel Despard is imprisoned in Coldbath Fields looking for an ally or for somebody to take up his cause, and Ross Poldark is now an MP, then they pick up their relationship again, and I think that this runs through the rest of the season. That's a really intriguing
interweaving of characters there, because I suppose what we're doing at this moment is we're looking down on someone who's been forgotten, and we're talking about him at a moment when he might be rediscovered by the British public in a kind of mass sense through this television programme.
Yes, and it's his only sort of real manifestation in British popular culture up to this point was that he was one of the figures. His death mask was displayed by Madame Tussaud in her first exhibition of her Separate Room, as it was called, which became known as the Chamber of Horrors. So for a lot of the 19th century, he could be seen underlit in sinister blue light as a villain, and so now in his kind of second incarnation in British political culture, he's becoming something quite different.
Well, I'm imagining this sinister blue light augurs badly for his fate in the years following our little visit, which is in January 1799. What happens to Despard? You say he became a cause célèbre in this time. Does that happen soon?
It does. In 1801, when William Pitt resigns and is replaced by Henry Addington as Prime Minister, Addington restores the right of habeas corpus, and in 1802 we have the Peace of Amiens. We have this brief peace between Britain and France at the end of war. So in that moment Despard emerges from Coldbath Fields. He's behaved with extraordinary honour and dignity.
And courage.
He's very keen to hold the government to account for what they did to him. He won't talk about any of his co-conspirators or any of the things he might know about possible revolutionary plots. And then, as many people predict, he is accused of a revolutionary plot himself, and in a very, very public trial is found guilty and executed.
This crystallises this moment of enormous anxiety on the part of the British government.
Yes,
about subversion, about radicalism, about revolution. All these things are bubbling away.
It's all that, and it also shows what a cul-de-sac the campaign for political reform has turned into. I think that's what Despard really tells us at this point in 1799, is an enormous number of people, people in their millions have signed petitions for political reform, have tried to envisage, a future in which politics is more equal, in which more people can vote, in which it is less corrupt, where power is less concentrated in the centre. All these ideas that have fermented through the 1790s have gone nowhere, and we've and Despard really in his tiny cell really exemplifies the fact that all these ideas have gone down a rabbit hole.
Well, it's a brilliant scene. We're going to leave it now. We're going to move on to our second one. So going from Coldbath Fields on the 1st of January, we're going to whiz halfway through the year, from the winter into the spring, and to Midsummer Day, the 24th of June. That's when the Georgians used to celebrate their Midsummer Day. What's happening and where are we now?
We are now in Bethlem, the Royal Bethlam Hospital, the legendary domain of the mad, which is this now crumbling but originally spectacular building in Moorfields that was built after the Great Fire of London, with Robert Hooke as the architect.
Just on the edge of the City of London?
Just on the edge, right by London Wall.
Yeah.
With a sort of 500-foot facade, looks like a French palace. And
so it's quite a big place.
It's huge, and it's got formal gardens out front, and big stone gates surmounted by these famous statues of raving and melancholy madness. But the interior is nothing like the exterior. The exterior is sort of spectacular.
Is that for show?
For show.
Yeah.
Behind it are two very poorly constructed and now crumbling galleries, one for men and one for women. If we want to paint a picture of what they look like, the most famous picture was obviously painted by William Hogarth in his last scene of the Rake's Progress, which is not to be taken too literally. It's an allegory as much as a literal representation, but it does show us the gallery with the individual cells off to the side, and the keepers or attendants in their blue coats and black hats, their charity workers' uniform.
Was Bethlem, a place that people feared?
Earlier in the 17th century, because it was so strapped for cash, like lots of charitable institutions for the care of the mad then and now, it was opened to visitors, and that's where we get the famous Bedlam scenes and Hogarth's Rake's Progress and so on. By 1799 that had been closed down. It was rowdy and cruel, and also Bethlem was doing a little bit better financially as a result of the exposure it had got. But by 1799 it was that same building, but in place of the chaos there was sort of silence and neglect. The building is crumbling, the grounds are overgrown. It's a place that people have forgotten about. Our character in one of these cells, James Tilly Matthews, is, I think we would probably, you'd still choose that over Despard's cell in Coldbath Fields.
It's not a luxurious choice by any stretch of the imagination.
It's not, but it's larger. It's 14 foot by 8 or something like that. He gets butter on his bread in the morning. He gets meat 3 times a week, and he's allowed, unlike Despard, to have pen and paper, and he is writing and drawing furiously and producing an extraordinary body of work.
Right, so I know James Tilly Matthews, you mentioned there very briefly. This is the reason we're in Bethlem, and James Tilly Matthews is a character you've written a whole book about, and numerous articles as well. So can you tell us why we're going there in the middle of 1799 to meet him? What's interesting about him?
Well, Matthews's story of why he is in Bedlam at this point is that he actually had a front row seat in the great event of the 1790s. He was in Paris in 1792-73 at the height of the French Revolution, and that he was acquainted with the members of the French Directory, and in fact just before France and England went to war, he had sat down with the members of the French Directory and put together a peace proposal for peace between France and Britain.
Just on his own, in his personal capacity?
Together with Jacques-Pierre Brissot, who was the Foreign Secretary of the French Directory, and that he'd shuttled back and forth between London and Paris. He'd presented this peace proposal to members of the government, to the cabinet, and to Pitt himself. So there was no need for France and Britain to be at war. There had been a peace proposal, and Matthews was being locked up because the government didn't want anybody to know about this. So this was all, at the time, taken to be part of his sort of his madness and his delusions. It's pretty much entirely true. However, Matthews also believed, with equal conviction, that by this time his mind was being controlled by a machine which he called an heirloom. He was admitted to Bedlam after standing up in the House of Commons and accusing the Home Secretary of treason, and he had published some of these letters about this peace plan in the Times and so on. He did have some small notoriety as a whistleblower, but he's now been entirely forgotten about and is locked in a very different battle with his sort of supervising doctor at Bedlam. So this is really the scene that I've always wanted to witness, is James Tilly Matthews and John Haslam, the apothecary, who had spent Midsummer Day 1799, as indeed all of 1799, and most of the next 10 years in the same building, often in the same cell, in a dialogue that would produce an extraordinary work by John Haslam that's in a way a collaboration between the two of them.
Right, so what is this work? Tell us about it.
This work is, when it's published eventually, is entitled Illustrations of Madness, and it's the first book-length study of the delusions of a mad person, written by John Haslam, who's the apothecary at Bethlem, not a physician. He doesn't have an MD, and he has a huge chip on his shoulder about this.
Okay. So
it's really kind of, the book is on one level a professional claim from Haslam, saying, I may not be a doctor, but I know a mad person when I see one. And the reason he has to do this is that, curiously, when James Tilly Matthews is not talking about this machine that's controlling his brain, that's being operated by a cell of undercover revolutionaries, Matthews is otherwise a very lovely person, very gentle, very intelligent, very articulate, and an awful lot of people don't understand why he's locked up. They think he's completely sane. His family are constantly petitioning the authorities for him to be allowed out, and other doctors are examining him and declaring him sane.
So what is this influencing machine that you mentioned a few minutes ago?
He calls it an heirloom, and he draws beautiful technical drawings of it, and it draws on all the great scientific advances of the 1790s. It's powered by pneumatic chemistry, in terms of the time that we'll hear more about later, the science of gases, which are woven with sort of mesmeric rays and animal magnetism and electric batteries into these kind of thought influencing rays that can be targeted at various people.
So who's in control of the heirloom machine? Is he in control of it, or does it have agency of its own?
It's being controlled by a gang of Jacobin revolutionaries, and who are tormenting him with it. But it's not the only heirloom in London. There are other heirlooms, particularly around Westminster and Whitehall, being targeted on major political figures, so including William Pitt, the Prime Minister. So when you hear William Pitt standing up and saying it's essential that we must continue this patriotic struggle against the evil French revolutionaries, that's not William Pitt at all. That's the heirloom gang puppeting him and keeping the war going for their own ends.
So I should clarify here, this is in the mind of James Tilly Matthew. This is his explanation for things, unless you're going to give us some revelation about Georgian politics at this time.
I believe that to be the case, but I think it's a fantastic contrast contraption and fantastic concept. Firstly, I think it's the first time that anybody's imagined a machine that could control the mind. And it's also something that draws on all these things that earlier in the 1790s were sort of great hopes of science that were going to transform the world. So Matthews's vision is one in which, all these sciences have come to fruition, but they're in the hands of the bad guys, and that's why the 1790s have turned out the way that they have.
So to see him on this day in June 1799, would he be ostensibly, a sane person? He's articulate, he's intelligent, he's in dialogue with the people around him. He's got his buttered bread and a bit of meat. But these are the years when he's thinking about the heirloom and making his discoveries about it. Is that right?
It all comes down to this extraordinary ironic relationship we had with John Haslam, because the only documents that we have are the ones that Haslam preserved, and the ones that Haslam preserved are the ones that he thought were most obviously mad, because he was using them as evidence for his case. So it may be that Matthews was writing a good deal of much saner stuff. We know that he was also taking notes on Haslam. He was also detailing Haslam's treatment of him and his abuses of him, and saying that, in the end, I'll show these to somebody, to some authority, and, these documents will bring you down. And in fact, they do. At the end of the story, Haslam is sacked for his treatment of Matthews. But Matthews is also producing some remarkable visionary work, particularly plans and descriptions of what he calls the new Bethlem. He's starting to envisage how the care of the mad could be transformed. And at the moment, as he says, the trouble with Bethlem is it's this top-down authoritarian institution that's being run like a prison. And, this is not only horrible for the patients, it also creates a lot of work for the staff and the authorities. Why don't we turn it into something that's more like a therapeutic community in which everybody has a stake? Why am I sitting in my cell? I could be gardening, producing food for everybody. So Matthews is also kind of incubating an idea that will turn out to be the idea that replaces the 18th century Georgian madhouse.
Yeah, he's pioneering medicine in a way, isn't
and
he?
The 19th century asylum, and the idea that madness is something that doesn't just need to be contained and managed, it can be treated and cured.
Yeah. So there's parallels as well as contrasts between Despard and Matthews, because they're obviously both incarcerated. Does he have much hope at this point in 1799 of regaining his liberty, or not?
Matthews, like Despard, really has been shut down. His wife and his family, who are trying to get him released, have been banned from visiting him. This is very unusual in Bethlem. Haslam has done so on the grounds that all the conversation with people like that sort of stirs his hopes that he might let out. And Haslam's theory of madness is that you have to obtain an ascendancy over the patient. While the patient's plotting their release and thinking that they're going to be justified, you can never cure them. They have to submit to the doctor's will. So there's this extraordinary battle of wills going on. And at this point, obviously, Haslam holds all the cards. He's all powerful, and Matthews is a completely powerless victim. But Matthews, in an extraordinary way, writes and imagines his way out of this situation.
So the last question on James Tilly Matthews is one I've asked about Despard, and it's, what did he look like? Do we know? Is there any visual representation of him that's survived?
We have no idea what he looks like. We know a bit about him. We know that he was Welsh, that he came to London as a young man, as a businessman. He was a tea broker, had an office in Leadenhall Street, and the only clue we have as to what he might look like is his drawing of the heirloom, where he draws this machine and all these sinister figures operating it, and the machine has a kind of beam of sort of thought ray coming out of it, and in the very corner of the picture is a figure whose mind is being controlled, who is a sort of small figure in with brown curly hair. And I've always imagined that might be Matthews himself. I can't
would have
imagine
been one of the strangest ever self-portraits you could imagine.
It would be, but also I can't imagine who else he would draw and represent in that position.
It's a fabulous, fascinating scene for the complexity of what's going on. We're going through 1799. We've done New Year's Day, we've done Midsummer Day, we're Boxing Day now, and where are we? Are we in another prison or somewhere?
No,
free?
Somewhere much, much more attractive.
Okay.
We're on the edges of Bristol in Hotwells, which is a district of Bristol down by the Avon Gorge. We're in a Georgian square called Dowry Square. We're in number 6, which is on the top corner of the square.
It still exists today, this property?
We're in a room that I'm lucky enough to have visited a couple of times. It's now a private property.
Yeah.
It's an upstairs, first floor drawing room, beautiful Georgian proportions, high ceilings, high windows. As you look out of it now, what you see is the elevated section of the A4, but in 1799 you would have been able to look out and walk straight out of Dowry Square onto Hotwell's Parade, which was the bit of the parade that runs down the side of the Avon, turn the corner and you're among the spectacular beauty of the Avon Gorge, where the Clifton Suspension Bridge now.
Okay, so that's really nicely located for us. So if that's the description of the place, why are we going? What's the attraction?
We have got the climactic experiment of the brilliant young chemist Humphry Davy with nitrous oxide. This is something that he's been exploring all through 1799. Humphry Davy has been employed as a chemical lab assistant by a doctor called Thomas Beddoes. Thomas Beddoes, like our other protagonists, had a very revolutionary, passionately progressive early 1790s. He was a great partisan of the French Revolution. He left Oxford, where he was a chemistry lecturer, under a cloud because of his support for the French Revolution. He came to Bristol. He's had not quite street fighting years, but Bristol throughout the 1790s, there have been lots of riots. The famous Bristol Bridge riot in 1796. Beddoes has been writing pamphlets against the gagging bills and against William Pitt, but he's also been developing this revolutionary idea for the medical application of pneumatic chemistry or gases.
Yeah, so this is the idea, isn't it, that I suppose best explained through this idea that people knew that if you went away to the seaside or to a spa or up into the hills, it might have a good effect on your health. The climate would be different, especially for people who had consumption tuberculosis, as we call it today. And that was the germ, sorry for the pun, of the idea that different gases could have different effects medicinally.
Yes, Thomas Beddoes was very, very aware consumption was the biggest killer disease in Britain at the time, and he was also starting to notice these occupational diseases that would become to be called miner's lung and so on. There was an epidemic of lung diseases, so Beddoes' idea at its most simple was, medicines at the moment are something we swallow or something we rub on the skin, but for all these lung diseases, surely the best way to treat them is with gases that can be inhaled directly to where they... The
story of Beddoes that I always remember is the one which you have in your Atmosphere of Heaven book, is this idea that the butchers would never get tuberculosis.
Mm-hmm.
This was an observation, because he was an empiricist.
He was.
He used to look around and see what was happening, and so he thought it was something to do with the proximity of animals to the sufferer. So he had all of these, well, I'm not sure if they were tubercular patients or what, but he had them in the cow shed with all these cows, and they'd be inhaling this air which had passed through various animals. Is that right?
It was an idea that he had. I'm not sure whether it ever quite got to fruition, but it's just such a wonderful image, and people had such fun with it. People like Maria Edgeworth, members of his circle, who were great wits. The idea that you have all these tubercular patients lying in their beds, and on the wall facing them would be some curtains, and you'd open the curtains and a cow would be there breathing at you. But Beddoes was aware that oxygen, which Joseph Priestley had recently isolated, was seemed to have candles burned longer in it than normal air, and mice lived longer in jars of it. There was this idea that there were gases that might be medicines, and that people were only just starting to explore. So Beddoes, through all his political turmoil in the 1790s, managed to get the Pneumatic Institution funded, which I think was probably the first
example. This is where we are, isn't it? We're in the Pneumatic
We're in the Pneumatic Institution.
And this is the Georgian townhouse.
Mm-hmm.
And we're with Beddoes' assistant, aren't we? Who is, or his laboratory superintendent, I suppose would be the right language for the Georgians, who's Humphry Davy.
That's right. And it's a completely new idea. We'd now call it a medical research institute, but there hadn't really been anything like that at the time. So what Humphry Davy was doing was systematically working through all the different gases that he could synthesize in the laboratory and testing them to see if they had any medical benefits.
And one of them in particular caught his attention in about April time, is that right?
That's right. Almost as soon as they started on this project, Humphry Davy synthesised nitrous oxide. He thought he'd inhale a little bit of it to see what it did, and it didn't seem to have any harm. He inhaled a bit more and felt what he called a highly pleasurable thrilling in the chest and extremities. He carried on inhaling it, and then in Thomas Beddoes' record, by the end of it, of his inhalation, he was leaping around the room shouting and giggling, and he'd been the first person to inhale what we now know as laughing gas. And I think this is the way this fits with the other stories, is that Beddoes, like Despard and like James Tilly Matthews, had lived through this kind of, grinding sort of political disaster of the 1790s. But Davy at this point was only 20. He didn't remember the French Revolution. He was he was a kind of avatar, a harbinger of the world that was going to emerge, once the dust had settled.
So we're on Boxing Day, so we can imagine Mr. Beddoes is full of turkey somewhere, if that part of Christmas has been invented yet. I'm not sure if it has. And we know that it's 8 months or something since he had this first experience with laughing gas.
Yes.
So what happens on Boxing Day, and why would you like to be there then?
Well, all through the summer, people have been coming and going and trying the nitrous oxide, and these people include Robert Southey and Tom Wedgwood, the son, Josiah Wedgwood's son, and Dr. Peter Mark Roget, Dr. Roget of Thesaurus fame. Everybody's been writing their descriptions of their experience. So, as usual, in the middle of this Georgian drawing room, he set up an apparatus designed by James Watt. James Watt and the Lunar Society were funders and supporters of this project. So there's an alembic in which ammonium nitrate is being heated, and the gas is escaping and being bubbled underwater, and James Watt has designed a special green silk airbag to inflate that people inhale from. But he's also, for patients who are too weak to lift this airbag to their mouth, he's designed this contraption which is a sedan chair enclosed by panels, so it's sort of like a phone box, airtight, into which gas can be pumped. So Davy has stripped to the waist, has stuck a thermometer under his armpit, and has got another doctor standing outside letting in nitrous oxide with a sort of 20% of oxygen as well, so he doesn't asphyxiate. So he's going to keep on inhaling nitrous oxide for an hour and then step out of the chamber. Yes.
Oh God. And how does this go? Well, we'll draw up a seat whilst the nitrous oxide goes in.
Yes.
How does he fare? Well, we know that he goes on to become the greatest scientist of his generation, and the Davy lamp and all that. So presumably he survives. How does the experiment go?
He writes about it in an extremely memorable passage. He says first of all, he completely loses connection with all external ideas, and he starts to inhabit this new world that's composed of thoughts and ideas and impressions that's completely unlike his previous existence. He steps out of this chamber, and Dr. Kinglake, his assistant, wants to know whether he's all right, and Davy, gathering his thoughts as best he can, pronounces, "Nothing exists but thoughts."
So, well, there we go. That's a success, I'd say.
The one thing that's happened in October, November is that Samuel Taylor Coleridge has returned from Germany, full of the new German idealist philosophy. Coleridge and Davy have become best friends. So I think, in a way, the idea that nothing exists but thoughts is an idea that's come from Coleridge and from poetry and from German philosophy as much as from science.
Yeah.
And they're working on very parallel tracks. One of the things that's been bugging him all the way through this is the search for what he calls a language of feeling. He finds that people have an extraordinary experience when they inhale nitrous oxide, but they're very poor at describing it. It's the old medical question, how do you feel? People can't really articulate it. So you've got this confluence of science and chemistry and poetry at this point, that's also, I think, got a political dimension behind it, in the sense that even if we can't escape from these political structures and from the war that's consumed our society, there are other ways of being free. We can construct the world in ways of our own choosing without having to engage with politics.
What you're saying is it's almost And Coleridge is a wonderful character to turn up halfway through any drug story. It's the kind of the great confusing factor, I suppose, if you just stick him in. But really, it's a story of people transcending, isn't it? Like with poetry, this idea that you're trying to find something metaphysical, something bigger.
I mean, it's very like, of course, we're just Coleridge is putting together the second edition of lyrical ballads at this point, and the preface will famously say, it's the business of poetry to talk about feelings and emotions.
If we think of all of these three characters that you've spoken about and take a step back, is there a sense of admiration for each of them in slightly different ways?
I think they're all admirable and all flawed in different ways. I think they're all very easy characters to identify with and to understand on some level, because I think those kind of progressive, enlightened figures of the 1790s are not very difficult for us to understand. They're all feminists, they're all anti-slavery. I think it's another couple of generations before we find characters who are as easily understandable to us, superficially at least.
I think, is there anything more that we can add to that scene? It's vivid enough in my mind with this, I suppose, a bit of a letterbox or a postbox or a telephone box is how you described it, sorry. And the nitrous oxide being pumped in, and Davy inside it, just about managing. I don't think we can improve on that vision. So let's leave those three scenes there. We always have a bit of supplementary business. I should have warned you about this, so I hope you're anticipating it. If you could bring one thing back from 1799 to 2019, what would you like to bring with you? You can bring an object or something tangible.
One of James Watt's green oiled silk bags that he designed for inhaling.
I was thinking about one of those. Maybe you could bring one for me as well.
Yes, they'd be a lot classier than the balloons and canisters that we find in the gutters and parks all over the place these days.
So it's the same thing, isn't it? So these little canisters that we see on the streets nowadays, which apparently are contributing to global warming, I read the other day.
Yes, nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas.
Which I'm sure that wasn't on Davy's mind.
No, but James Watt kind of designed these bags very carefully. They were kind of oiled and they're dusted with charcoal on the inside to absorb impurities.
We'll let you have one of those.
Let's
have one of those. Perfect. So you mentioned the connection here with the Poldark series, which is just out now. So I suppose we can go and watch that. But then there's the books as well, because with each of these scenes you've got a tallying book that you've written. I know there's from the Despard scene, you've got your book, which is basically his story right through.
I've done a revised edition, particularly Catherine Despard, his wife. A lot more work has been done in the meantime.
Well, exactly. That sounds like an interesting part or dimension to the story, which tallies with new research in black histories and black lives, which is going on at the moment.
There's such a lot of that going on. More facts have turned up about Catherine. It's possible to contextualise that much more, so I've been able to say more about that.
Brilliant. And then, of course, we've got the James Tilly Matthews book, which is The Heirloom Gang.
The Influencing Machine.
The Influencing Machine. And, of course, Atmosphere of Heaven, which goes right through the Beddoes experiments into Humphry Davy, and is one of my favourite tours through that particular part of Georgian history. It's a wonderful read. I think we'll leave it there. It's been a really good conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Enormously. Thank you very much.
Let's go back out into Notting Hill. Bye-bye. Well, that was me, Peter Moore, talking to Mike J about Humphry Davy, James Tilly Matthews and Edward Marcus Despard just the other day. Mike's book, The Unfortunate Colonel Despard, has been reissued in conjunction with the new series of Poldark, which is currently being broadcast on BBC One. And that title, along with Mike's other books on the history of science and medicine, comes very much recommended by me. If you'd like to read much more about 1799, about the 1790s in general, or indeed about the entire revolutionary age, then do check out our pages on historytoday.com, where you'll find links to articles written by experts from the archives of the world's leading serious history magazine. Now, we're going to finish for the summer now. There's not going to be any more episodes in August because we've come to the end of our first season of Travels Through Time. It began way back in January, you might remember, in the 1840s with Sir Michael Palin talking about HMS Erebus, and it's taken us right through to that scene with Humphry Davy and the Laughing Gas. In between, we've been really everywhere, from ancient Greece to ancient Rome to Churchill's War Cabinet, to the Moon with Cassius St. Clair. We've looked at Isaac Newton and the Principia Mathematica, and there's been all sorts of things in between. We're aiming to bring you much more of the same in a second season of Travels Through Time, which is going to begin on the first Tuesday in September. I'm very grateful to all our guests, but I'm even more grateful to you for listening in. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've found it hugely rewarding and interesting as I've gone along, but there's nothing more for me to say now apart from have a lovely summer, and we hope you'll join us once again in September. From me, and for now, that's it. Thank you very much for listening.